The first time my therapist told me to come back wearing a skirt, I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking, and when she didn't laugh with me, when she just sat there with her hands folded over her yellow legal pad and that steady expression she always had when she knew something about me before I was ready to say it out loud. The room seemed to shrink around me until the diplomas on her wall looked like accusations, and the soft lamp beside her chair felt brighter than an interrogation light. I remember saying, "You can't be serious," and she tilted her head and said, "I'm completely serious, Daniel," in the calmest voice I had ever heard, which somehow made it worse, because if she had sounded playful I could have dismissed it, if she had sounded cruel I could have stormed out, but she sounded clinical, certain, almost compassionate, and I didn't know what to do with that. I had come to therapy because of panic attacks, because of the chest tightening, vision blurring, sweat-soaked episodes that kept hitting me in elevators, in meetings, in grocery store lines, because I was 34 years old and successful on paper and falling apart in private. I worked in compliance for a banking software company. I had a one-bedroom apartment with a gray sofa and matching gray curtains and the kind of kitchen that looked as if no one had ever really lived in it. I had a gym membership I barely used and a father who described me to his friends as dependable, and I had spent most of my adult life learning how to appear stable, while something inside me throbbed like a trapped pulse. I thought therapy would teach me breathing exercises and stress management. I did not expect Dr. Evelyn Mercer to spend 7 sessions quietly dismantling the version of me I had carried like a shield and then ask me to show up in feminine clothes. "This is absurd," I told her. "I'm not doing some humiliating roleplay." She didn't blink. "Then don't think of it as roleplay," she said. "Think of it as data collection." I hated that answer. Hated how reasonable it sounded, hated that the word data landed inside my neatly organized, control-obsessed brain like a key slipping into a lock. "You think dressing like a woman is going to cure my anxiety?" I asked. "No," she said. "I think pretending you have no relationship to femininity is one of the engines driving it." I should tell you now that she wasn't guessing. She had seen things I had spent decades disguising. The hesitation every time she asked me how I felt in my body. The way my eyes drifted, despite myself, to fabrics, colors, details when I described strangers in the world. The way I said I felt invisible and exposed at the same time, as if I were failing at being seen correctly. The way I referred to my masculinity as if it were a task list, not a self. She had asked me, in our 3rd session, what I would wear if no one could judge me, and I had said, "Too fast. Same thing I always wear," before picturing a soft cream sweater slipping off one shoulder and hating myself for how quickly that image had arrived. She had noticed the pause. She noticed everything. "I'm not ordering your feminization," she said then, and for a second I thought I had won, but she leaned forward and added, "I'm assigning you honesty." It would make a better story if I said I stood up right there and stormed out, but I didn't. That was the problem. I didn't. I sat there frozen, because beneath the outrage there was a live wire of terror that felt too specific to be random. I remember staring at the seam in the rug between us and hearing myself say, "And if I refuse?" Her answer came without judgment. "Then we'll keep talking in circles while your body keeps telling the truth for you." It was the cruelest accurate sentence anyone had ever said to me. I left the office shaking. I walked 6 blocks before I realized I had gone in the wrong direction. I spent that night pacing my apartment, opening the fridge and closing it, turning on the television and muting it, standing in front of the bathroom mirror under that pitiless white light and trying to see what she thought she saw. All I saw at first was the same face I had been dragging through my life for years. Tired eyes, trimmed beard, hard jaw, shoulders I had built in the gym like armor. But then, because once a forbidden thought is named it becomes impossible to bury again, I noticed what I had spent years noticing only by accident. How much gentler my face looked when I loosened my mouth, how my features shifted if I tilted my chin slightly, how the severity I presented to the world was something I actively held in place. I stepped back from the mirror as if it had insulted me. I didn't sleep. The next evening, I stood outside a department store 20 minutes from my apartment because I was too afraid to shop anywhere I might run into someone who knew me. The automatic doors opened and closed in front of me while people drifted in with the easy anonymity I had envied all my life. I almost left 3 times. On the 4th, I went in. Even now I can remember the shock of the women's section, not because it was glamorous, but because it was ordinary. Bright blouses, neatly folded jeans, mannequins that didn't care who looked at them, racks labeled petite and tall and workwear and lounge, as mundane and practical as any other corner of retail. For years I had carried this image of feminine clothing as some glowing forbidden world, and standing there between cardigan displays and a sale table of scarves, I felt something stranger than temptation. I felt grief. Grief for how normal it all was, how accessible, how unnecessary all my fears suddenly looked under fluorescent lights. I picked up a soft gray sweater and almost dropped it because the fabric felt like a confession. I took a black midi skirt because it seemed plain enough to be defensible, as though I were building a legal case for my own purchase. I added tights, then put them back, then took them again. My hands were trembling so badly that a sales associate asked if I needed help, and I said no too quickly, expecting suspicion, but she just smiled politely and moved on. That tiny kindness nearly broke me. I bought the clothes at self-checkout, stuffed them into a plain paper bag, and drove home with the bag on the passenger seat like it might start speaking. I didn't touch it for an hour. I made coffee. I didn't drink. I answered 2 work emails I barely read. Finally, as dusk turned my apartment windows into mirrors, I carried the bag into the bedroom and locked the door, even though I lived alone. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my throat. I laid the sweater and skirt on the bed as carefully as if I were handling evidence. There are moments in a life that split time into before and after, and people imagine them as dramatic, cinematic things, but often they are painfully quiet. Mine was the sound of a zipper and the hiss of fabric sliding over skin. The skirt settled around my waist, awkward at first because my hands didn't know how to move with it. The sweater slipped on second, softer than anything I owned. I stood there in the dim bedroom light, one hand braced against the dresser, and the strangest thing happened. I didn't feel ridiculous. I didn't feel aroused. I didn't feel like I was playing dress up. I felt still. More still than I had felt in years. It was not joy, not yet, and definitely not relief in any simple sense. It was the abrupt absence of noise. The internal grinding that usually ran under everything I did had gone quiet, and that silence was so startling I almost burst into tears from pure shock. I turned toward the mirror with the dread of someone approaching a verdict. The person looking back at me was unfinished, mismatched, scared, beard shadow still visible, posture stiff, face pale, but something in the overall picture was so unmistakably closer to the truth than the man in pressed shirts and leather shoes that my knees actually gave out, and I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, clutching at the sweater as if it were the only solid thing in the room. I cried then, not elegantly, not meaningfully, just years of pressure releasing in hot, humiliating waves. I cried because it felt familiar. I cried because it felt impossible. I cried because once you see yourself even dimly, even through fear and bad lighting and cheap department store fabric, it becomes a kind of violence to go fully blind again. I almost canceled my next appointment. Instead, I showed up 20 minutes early and spent those extra minutes in my car trying not to vomit. I had changed in the office restroom before coming into session, my jeans folded into my messenger bag, my legs trapped in black tights that felt both exposing and protective, the same sweater on, though now I had shaved more closely than I ever had in my life and nicked my jaw twice doing it. Every person in the waiting room looked up when I entered, or at least it felt that way. A teenager with headphones glanced over. An older man pretended not to. The receptionist smiled too brightly. I sat with my knees pressed together because I had no idea where to put them. When Dr. Mercer opened the door and said my name, there was no surprise on her face, only a small careful nod, as if she understood the scale of what it had taken just to cross that room. I walked in and sat down and avoided her eyes for a full minute. "Tell me what's happening in your body," she said. "Everything," I muttered. "That's not precise enough for you," she replied, and I hated her for being right. I took a breath. "I'm terrified. My skin feels too thin. I can't tell if I want to disappear or stay exactly like this forever." For the first time since I had met her, she smiled. "That," she said, "is an honest sentence." Therapy after that did not become easier. despite what people assume when they hear stories like mine, and imagine some smooth awakening montage. It got messier, harder, less defensible. Dr. Mercer never told me I was a woman. She never handed me an identity, like a prescription. Instead, she asked horrible, precise questions that lodged under my ribs and stayed there for days. When did I first learn softness was dangerous for me? What did I feel when I was called handsome? Why did being praised as a man always leave me vaguely bereaved? Which parts of femininity drew me, and which parts frightened me? Whether I wanted permission, anonymity, or recognition. She gave me assignments that felt absurdly simple and emotionally catastrophic. Buy one item of clothing you would choose if no one ever saw the receipt. Remove all your body hair from one part of yourself and record not how you look but how you feel afterward. Spend one evening at home without correcting any naturally feminine gestures. Try a different name in writing and see whether your pulse changes when you read it back. It was that last one that nearly ended me. I wrote dozens.
Claire, Mara,
Julia.
Elise, Naomi.
None of them were right, and every wrong one left me embarrassed, like a teenager trying on personalities. Then one night, almost in irritation, I wrote Danny, and something inside me went perfectly still again, the same way it had the first night in the skirt.
Danny.
Not because it was clever, not because it was close to Daniel, but because it felt like a door I had always been standing in front of without noticing. I wrote it again and again until the page looked obsessive. Danny Mercer, Danny Reed, Danny Parker, Danny in different handwriting styles, as if a more elegant penmanship could summon a more legible future. The next session, Dr. Mercer asked whether I had tried any names. I said, maybe, and she said, read me the one that scares you most. I whispered it so softly, I thought she wouldn't hear.
She did.
Hello, Danny, she said. I wish I could explain what a simple greeting can do when it is the first time your inner self hears daylight. I cried again, obviously. By then I was crying in almost every session. That spring became a season of mirrors. The bathroom mirror, where I learned makeup from silent videos watched at 2 a.m, wiping off my failures before dawn. The elevator mirror at work, where I began to see how performed my masculinity was, how I set my shoulders before the doors opened, how I flattened my voice and widened my stance like someone following old choreography. The fitting room mirrors, where I discovered that clothes were not magic and yet still had power, that a blouse in the wrong cut could make me feel grotesque, but a simple pair of high-waisted trousers could make my entire center of gravity feel truer. The mirror in my therapist's office bathroom, where one afternoon I stood with tinted lip balm trembling in my fingers and thought, if I walk out with this visible, there is no version of me left that can convincingly claim ignorance. I walked out with it visible. Dr. Mercer did not compliment it. She did not make a big moment of it. She just asked, how much energy are you spending trying to look unchanged? And that question followed me for a week like a haunting. The emotional twists did not come neatly. They came in humiliations, coincidences, almost disasters. One Saturday, my younger sister Nora called and asked if she could stop by because she was in the neighborhood, which was nonsense because she lived 40 minutes away and never happened to be near my apartment by accident. I shoved every feminine thing I owned into the hall closet before she arrived, sprayed room freshener as if lipstick had a scent, and opened the door with the strained smile of a man trying to look casual while his heart tried to punch through his ribs. Nora walked in, set down her tote bag, looked at me for about 3 seconds and said, "You missed some mascara." My entire body went cold. I must have looked as if I had been shot because she immediately softened, her face collapsing from mischief into concern. "Danny," she said, using the nickname no one had called me in years. "Breathe." I didn't. I backed up until I hit the kitchen counter. "How long have you known?" I asked, and even then I couldn't finish the sentence. She understood anyway. "Not exactly known," she said. "But I guess there was something. For a long time, actually." The rage that followed surprised me more than anything. "You guessed," I snapped. "And you said nothing?" She stared at me, then said quietly, "You were barely surviving your own silence. What did you want me to do? Drag you out of it before you were ready?" I hated how fair that was. I sank into a chair at the kitchen table, hands shaking. She pulled something from her tote bag and slid it toward me. It was a small rectangular box, old, floral, with a crack along one corner. I knew it instantly. Or rather, I knew the sensation of it before I knew the object, the memory arriving ahead of logic like a smell from childhood. Mom kept this, Nora said. I opened it with fingers gone numb. Inside was a little plastic barrette shaped like a butterfly, cheap costume jewelry, and a folded photograph that had gone soft at the edges. In the picture, I was maybe 7, wrapped in one of our mother's scarves, laughing at something outside the frame. My father had taken the picture, I realized with a start, because he was the only one who ever held the camera back then. I was standing in the living room, scarf over my hair like a veil, mouth open in joy. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. Nora sat across from me. "After Mom died, I found a box in the attic. She'd kept little things. Drawings, school stuff, random junk. This was in there." I stared at the photo until the room blurred. "Did Dad know?" I asked. Nora hesitated too long. "He knew enough," she said at last. "I think he thought if nobody talked about it, it would disappear." That was the first time I understood my childhood not as a series of isolated shames, but as a quiet family emergency no one had named. Nora reached across the table. "I'm not here to interrogate you," she said. "I'm here because if you're doing this alone, you don't have to." The kindness of that nearly hurt more than the fear. Within 2 weeks, my sister had taken me shopping in daylight. Not hidden, not across town, not as a panicked covert mission, but openly, with a coffee in one hand and ruthless honesty in the other. She steered me away from clothes that looked like costumes and toward clothes that looked like a life. "You don't need to become a stereotype to become yourself," she told me in a fitting room while I stood inside a navy wrap dress feeling like I might dissolve. "You need to stop buying for an imaginary audience that hates you." Nora was merciless in exactly the way I needed. She wiped off overdone eyeliner, showed me how to blend concealer under my eyes, told me when a color washed me out, made me walk back and forth in shoes until I stopped moving like a hostage. We laughed, too, which felt almost criminal at first. I had associated this part of me so completely with fear that joy felt suspicious, but Nora kept dragging me toward ordinary delight. "Try this one," she'd say, tossing a sweater over the fitting room door. "No, not because it's feminine. Because it makes your eyes look alive." That sentence stayed with me. Alive. Not convincing. Not passable. Alive. At work, meanwhile, the panic attacks changed shape. They didn't disappear, but I began to notice they spiked most violently on mornings when I forced myself into extra masculine presentation, dark suit, stiff tie, voice pitched lower in meetings, as if overcorrection might somehow erase what I had begun to uncover. One Monday in June, after a weekend spent at Nora's apartment learning how to shape my brows and talking more honestly than we had in a decade, I stood in the office restroom staring at my reflection and couldn't make myself put the tie back on after washing my hands. I had taken it off because it felt like a leash. I stood there so long that one of the junior analysts, Priya, walked in and asked if I was okay. I said yes automatically, and she looked at the tie in my hand, then at my face and said, "You know, you don't have to answer every question with yes." It was such a strange thing to say that I actually laughed. She smiled, washed her hands, and as she left, she added, "For what it's worth, you look more comfortable without it." I don't know whether she meant anything by that, but it cracked something open in me. A week later, I got called into my manager's office and genuinely thought I was about to be fired. I had been distracted, brittle, late on 2 internal reviews, and visibly frayed. My manager, Elise, closed the door and asked me to sit, and I started mentally cataloging severance possibilities. Instead, she said, "I'm going to ask a question, and you do not have to answer it if you don't want to, but is there something going on with your identity that is making work harder than it needs to be?" I went so still I think she worried she had crossed a line. "Why would you ask that?" I managed. She exhaled and folded her hands. "Because I've seen people before they come out, and I've seen panic that has nothing to do with deadlines. And because our HR department can be more helpful than you probably assume." I stared at her. "You're saying this company has dealt with that. She almost smiled. Daniel, this is a software company, not the surface of the moon. That should not have been the sentence that undid me, but it was. Something about the dry normalcy of it. Not the surface of the moon. Not an impossible environment. Just a workplace with policies and paperwork and maybe, if I could survive my own terror, room for me.
I didn't come out that day.
I barely spoke. But I left that office with a packet Elise had printed from the internal HR portal, a transition support document I was too afraid to open until midnight. There it was in sterile corporate language. Chosen names, email changes, dress code neutrality, restroom access, manager guidance. I read it 3 times. Bureaucracy had never looked so tender. Still, the hardest person in my life was never going to be HR. It was my father, Richard Reed, retired police lieutenant, believer in order and restraint and the dangerous fragility of appearances. We were not close, not in any way that mattered, but we had maintained a functional adult relationship built on weather reports, practical favors, and mutual omission. He called every Sunday at 7 and asked if I had changed the oil in my car and whether work was busy. I answered in sentences that kept my soul out of it. For months, I avoided seeing him in person, but avoidance is a temporary architecture. Eventually, Nora told me he had asked questions. Why I sounded different. Why I wasn't dating. Why I'd stopped wearing ties to family dinners. I don't even know how he knew that last part. Fathers like mine notice everything they claim not to care about. The confrontation came in August, on a humid evening when the sky looked bruised, and I was already exhausted from a day of feeling like my skin had no proper edge. He called and said he was nearby and could stop over if I was home. I should have lied. Instead, I said yes, maybe because some part of me was tired of curating myself for men. I was wearing dark jeans, a loose ivory blouse from Nora's latest intervention, and clear polish on my nails that only showed when the light caught it. My hair, grown longer over the past months, brushed my ears. Not dramatic. Not deniable. He stepped into my apartment, took one look at me, and the temperature of the room changed. "What is this?" he said, not loudly, which was worse. I shut the door. "Hi, Dad." "Don't do that," he snapped. "Don't act like I'm crazy for seeing what I'm seeing." I had rehearsed versions of this conversation, noble versions, calm versions, eloquent versions. What came out instead was, "I'm tired." He frowned as if I had answered in another language. "Tired of what?" "Pretending you don't know me," I said, before I could stop myself. He looked genuinely struck by that, which only made me angrier. He started pacing my tiny living room, a big man trying to contain rage inside furniture too delicate for it. "Your mother worried about you," he said suddenly. "She worried because I was miserable," I shot back. "She worried because you were always off somewhere in your head," he said. "Because you didn't act like other boys." The old ache of that phrase cut so deep it almost felt clean. "And what did you do with that information?" I asked. He stared at me. "I tried to make you stronger." "No," I said, and my voice shook but didn't break. "You tried to make me simpler." He looked away then, toward the kitchen, toward the window, toward anywhere but me. "This is a phase," he muttered, though he said it like a plea, not a belief. "You're under stress. Somebody's filling your head with nonsense." And there it was, the easiest villain in the story, the therapist. I almost laughed. "No one had to fill my head," I said. "I've been trying to empty it for years." He left 10 minutes later, without touching the coffee he had asked for. At the door he paused as if he might say something salvaging, something paternal, but all he managed was, "I don't understand this." I was too tired to be cruel. "I know," I said. "I've understood that my whole life." After he left, I sat on the floor with my back against the sofa and stared at nothing for over an hour. That was the night I nearly quit. Therapy, transition, all of it. Not because I had changed my mind, but because I suddenly saw the cost as a skyline stretching farther than I could imagine. The administrative things, the social things, the legal things, the 1,000 small deaths of old expectations. I thought, maybe I could shrink this back down to private. Maybe I could be Danny only in my apartment, in my therapist's office, in Nora's guest room on weekends. Maybe that would be enough. The next morning, I texted Dr. Mercer to cancel our upcoming session. She replied with one sentence. If you want to stop because this isn't true, I'll support that. If you want to stop because the truth is expensive, we should talk first. I hated her again. I showed up. I can't do this to my family, I told her. You mean you can't survive their discomfort, she corrected gently. That's different. I buried my face in my hands. He looked at me like I had died. And how long have you been looking at yourself that way? She asked. That question wrecked me because it exposed the real battleground. My father's confusion hurt, yes. His disappointment was brutal. But neither of those things matched the violence of my own long self-erasure. For years I had participated in my disappearance and called it maturity. I had stood at my own funeral in 100 subtle ways and accepted condolences from no one. Something in me was too tired to keep doing that. Around that time, the physical changes I allowed myself began to accumulate in ways even strangers could see. My brows shaped. My skin softened under routines that had once felt embarrassingly indulgent and now felt like maintenance of a person I intended to keep alive. My closet shifted by attrition, masculine uniforms quietly replaced by draped blouses, fitted trousers, cardigans, low boots, soft colors I had once only admired on other people. My voice changed too, not in pitch exactly, but in permission. I stopped clipping my speech into hard edges. I stopped apologizing for warmth. One evening, Nora took a candid photo of me while I was laughing at something on her phone, and when she showed it to me, I didn't have the old flash of alienation. I saw someone tender-faced, uncertain, a little tired, but unmistakably me. Not a trick. Not a fantasy.
Me.
That photo stayed as the lock screen on my phone for months because I needed proof that I was not inventing myself out of thin air. The first time I went out fully as Danny in public without Nora beside me, it was to a bookstore cafe on a rain-heavy afternoon. I almost turned back twice between the car and the door. I was wearing a blue sweater dress, black tights, a long coat, and enough makeup to steady me without feeling masked. Every step felt audible. I was sure everyone could tell. I was sure every eye carried a private verdict. Then I got inside and the barista asked, "Name for the order?" And I heard myself say, "Danny," and she wrote it on the cup without hesitation, without curiosity, without drama, just another name among names, and I stood there holding that paper cup like it was a legal document from the universe.
Danny.
Called aloud 5 minutes later by a stranger who had no idea she had just returned something to me I thought I might never have in public space. I sat in the corner by the window and cried into my coffee like a stereotype, but I did not leave. It wasn't all victories. There were bad nights. Nights when dysphoria arrived like a sudden weather front, and every angle of my body felt wrong. Nights when I washed off makeup, and the face in the mirror seemed to retreat from me in real time. Nights when a careless sir from a cashier could unravel hours of hard-won steadiness. There were bureaucratic frustrations, too, and medical waiting lists, and decisions I was not yet ready to make, but could feel circling my future. I am not going to lie and pretend self-discovery transformed me into a beacon of confidence. It made me raw first. It made me visible to myself, which is often more frightening than being visible to others. But something had changed at the root. Even on the hardest days, I no longer believed the answer was to become more masculine. That door had closed. I had too much evidence. The suspense in my life shifted from who am I to how much of me can survive daylight. In October, after almost 6 months of circling the issue, I told Dr. Mercer I thought I might be more than a man who liked feminine clothes, and she did not reward me with revelation. She simply asked, "When you imagine growing old, which future feels less like a theft?" That question took me weeks. I pictured 2 versions of my life. In one, I remained Daniel publicly, privately nursing this hidden annex of self, becoming more polished at suppression, more functional perhaps, more acceptable, and emptier every year. In the other, I became Danny more fully, with all the uncertainty and social costs that implied, risking rejection, paperwork, awkwardness, maybe estrangement, but also risking wholeness. One future felt easier to explain. The other felt possible to inhabit. When I finally said to Dr. Mercer, I think I'm a woman. Or, at least I think I'm moving toward a life where that is truer than anything else I've ever said. I expected fanfare from a universe. Thunder, a solved equation. What I got was a very quiet room and my therapist saying, "That sounds like something worth treating with care."
Care.
Not urgency. Not spectacle. Not ideology.
Care.
I built the rest slowly from there. I came out to Priya first at work because she had become, through a series of small mercies, the safest person in the office. We were eating soup at a place downstairs from the building when I blurted it out in one rush, so fast the sentence tripped over itself. She set down her spoon and said, "Okay," with such immediate steadiness that I laughed from sheer relief. "That's it?" I asked. "What? You wanted me to flip the table," she said. Then she smiled. "What name should I use?" I told her. She used it at once. That kind of instant adaptation feels like witnessing a new law of physics. Over the next month, with HR's help and Elise's support, I made a plan. Internal systems first. Team disclosure second. Wider rollout after. There were forms, training notes, awkward meetings with people trying very hard to be progressive without sounding rehearsed. There were also genuine moments of grace. Elise asking whether I wanted her to correct people for me in meetings. Priya changing my chat display name the second IT cleared it and sending me a screenshot with 6 celebratory emojis. A quiet older accountant named Marlene stopping by my desk after the announcement to say, "You seem lighter," and moving on before I had to formulate a response. By then, I did seem lighter. Not finished. Not fearless. But less haunted. My father remained the storm front on the horizon. We barely spoke for nearly 2 months after that first confrontation. Then, unexpectedly, he called in November and asked if I would meet him at the diner near his house. I spent the entire drive there imagining fresh disaster. When I arrived, he was already seated in a booth, hands around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just less defended. "You look different," he said when I sat down. I almost replied with something sharp, but there was no accusation in his tone this time, only observation and fatigue. "I am different," I said. He nodded once. For a while, all we had was the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the grill behind the counter. Then he pulled something from his jacket pocket, a folded note, yellowed at the crease. "I found this in one of your mother's recipe books," he said. "I don't know when she put it there." He handed it across the table. My hand shook opening it. The handwriting was hers, rounded and quick. It wasn't a grand letter, not one of those impossibly convenient messages fiction likes to hide for the exact right moment. It was a scrap, maybe meant for herself, maybe for him, maybe for no one. It read, "If Daniel ever tells us something hard about who he is, we have to love first and understand second." I stared at the words until they doubled. My father looked down at the table.
She saw more than I did, he said.
She always did. I wanted that note to solve everything. It didn't. It didn't erase years of pressure or the damage of silence. But it cracked open a door neither of us had known how to touch. "I don't know how to do this," he said, the same sentence as before, but without the wall around it. "Then learn," I said, and my voice broke on the word. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once, small, like a man accepting a difficult order from someone he no longer believed he outranked. That winter, I told Dr. Mercer I had been thinking about the title in my head, the melodramatic version of my own life story. Therapist orders my feminization, as if she had orchestrated the whole thing by force, and she laughed for what felt like the first time in months. "You know that isn't what happened," she said. "I know," I admitted, but it felt like that at first. She leaned back in her chair. "What it probably felt like," she said, "was someone refusing to let you keep calling self-erasure normal." I have thought about that sentence often since. Because the truth is, I wanted an order. I wanted authority, an external command, something I could point to and say this happened to me, not I chose it. Choice is terrifying when the stakes are identity. Choice means ownership. Choice means you cannot blame the universe if the truth costs you something. It was easier, for a while, to imagine Dr. Mercer as the villain of a dramatic story than to admit she had simply interrupted the lie I was using to survive. She didn't create Danny. She cornered Daniel until he stopped protecting the walls that kept Danny buried. By the beginning of the next year, I had come out to most of my life. Some people surprised me with softness. Some disappeared. Some treated the whole thing like a software update they were mildly annoyed to install. A college friend I hadn't seen in years sent flowers with a note that said, "About time you looked as kind as you always sounded." An uncle stopped speaking to me entirely. My father practiced my name in private before he said it to my face, and the first time he managed it without stumbling, we were both so startled by the tenderness of the moment that neither of us addressed it directly. Nora took me to get my ears pierced in January, and as ridiculous as it sounds after everything else, that tiny pair of silver studs made me feel more officially arrived than any HR form ever had. There were more decisions ahead, some medical, some legal, some social, all of them layered with complexity. But the center of a story had already turned. I was no longer deciding whether to vanish. I was deciding how to remain. The biggest twist, in the end, was not that I became someone else. It was that becoming visible made my old life legible for the first time. I could finally understand why every compliment about my masculinity had landed like sand in my mouth. Why mirrors had felt like homework. Why desire, in the innocent broad sense of wanting a life, had always seemed aimed slightly to the left of where I was standing. Why anxiety had gripped me most violently when I was being praised for playing the wrong role well. My body had never been malfunctioning. It had been protesting. That realization did not magically erase fear, but it gave the fear context, and context can be the difference between madness and map. The last session before Dr. Mercer took a 2-week holiday break, I arrived wearing a soft wine-colored sweater, dark skirt, tights, heeled ankle boots I could finally walk in without thinking, and a simple necklace Nora had given me for my birthday. My hair brushed my shoulders. My makeup was light. My posture, for once, was unforced. Dr. Mercer looked at me for a long moment and said, "You seem present." I sat down and laughed softly. That's because I am. We spent most of that session talking not about crisis, but about ordinary life, which felt more miraculous than any cinematic breakthrough. Grocery shopping without panic. Sending emails without rehearsing a masculine persona. Letting myself be photographed. Imagining a future apartment with colors other than gray. Ordinary things. At the end, as I stood to leave, I paused at the door and said, "You know, if I ever tell this story, I'm still going to say you ordered my feminization." She smiled, knowing exactly what I meant and what I didn't. "As long as you also tell the ending correctly," she said. "Which is?" I asked. She held my gaze. "That nobody ordered you to become yourself. You just finally got tired of living under the sentence of being someone else." I left her office and stepped into the winter air, feeling that familiar bite against my cheeks, the city moving around me in all its indifferent momentum, buses sighing at the curb, strangers in scarves hurrying past with their own private emergencies, and for the first time in my adult life, I did not feel like I was watching existence through glass. I felt inserted into it, fragile and unfinished and real. My phone buzzed with a message from Nora asking if I still wanted to come over that night because she was making soup, and another from Priya asking whether I could review a spreadsheet tomorrow, and then, a second later, one more from my father that simply said, "Hope the roads aren't bad, Danny." I stood there on the sidewalk staring at that name until the whole street blurred silver around me. People kept passing. No music swelled. No one applauded. The world did not pause to honor revelation. It just went on, and for once that was not tragic to me. It was beautiful, because it meant I could go on too, not as a ghost in a well-tailored costume, not as a sun carved down to fit somebody else's comfort, not as a man applauded for disappearing with discipline, but as the woman who had been waiting under every panic attack, every mirror, every silence, every forbidden softness, every half-lived year, and if anyone asks me now how it started, I could say it started with a therapist's impossible assignment, or with a skirt in a paper bag, or with my sister saying I missed some mascara, or with a note my mother never meant to become prophecy. But the truest answer is that it started the moment I realized my fear was not proof I was fake, it was proof I was standing at the edge of the life that belonged to me, and once I saw that, Once I understood that the trembling in my hands was not only shame but also arrival, there was no going back. Because the person I had spent years calling impossible had already opened her eyes, already spoken. Her name, already stepped into the light. And once Danny began to live, Daniel became what he had always really been. Not a prison, not a lie, not an enemy, but the brave, exhausted shell that carried me all the way to the door and finally, mercifully, let me walk through it.